Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double header today. We are in the Far East looking at Japanese war crimes this morning, and then or the evening, depending on where you are in the world. Then later today, we're looking at the Third Reich and their crimes. So anyway, right now, Adam Wakeling, a writer and historian, joins me to talk about his book, Stern Justice. It's the first show about the Japanese war crimes on this channel. We will talk about the fierce debate that raged in 1945 about who should be tried and how the process should work. And we're going to be particularly talking about Australia's role in the whole process. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Adam. How are you today?
Good evening or good morning, Paul. Where you are, and thanks for having me on the program.
So we were just discussing before going live there that the Far East trials, the Japanese war crimes, seem to get less attention than the trials of the Nazis. Maybe it's because of the big names involved in the trials of the Germans. Maybe it's because of the sort of the concentration, whereas there were war crimes across various parts of the Far East, the Philippines, and you know, there's Australia's involvement and things like that. So, well, before we begin talking about it, that was obviously your intention, was to bring this story to a wider group of people because it isn't talked about, even in Australia, when the Third Reich's crimes are less applicable.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So Nuremberg trials are very famous, and the big names are a big reason for that. Also, Germany had consistent leadership through the war. While Japan didn't. Japan went through a revolving door of ministers, so they weren't those same big figures as they were those people around Hitler. And obviously there was the Holocaust, which captured imagination in Europe as such a massive crime against humanity that obviously there was a huge interest, and even still today, interest in ensuring that was dealt with and those people were brought to justice, and there was some sort of justice for the victims. The Nuremberg trial was also much better run than the Tokyo trial, which was the equivalent of the Far East, and so probably achieved a better effect that way. But that was absolutely my intention of writing the book. It was interesting because even as somebody who's into Second World War history, who's a lawyer myself, who's into legal history, who's into Japanese history and the history of the 20th century, I went for years without knowing these trials in the Pacific had taken place. And it was only in 2014 or 2015 when I read the book, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which won the 2014 Man Booker Prize. It's by an Australian author, Richard Flanagan. Part of the book takes place on the Burma Railroad, among the British and Australian prisoners of war on the Burma Railroad. And at the end of the novel, he makes a reference to the Japanese guards being put on trial. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard of these war crimes trials of the guards on the Burma Railroad, so I better go find a book to read so I can learn something about it. And I couldn't find a general book on the Pacific war crimes trial, so I ended up writing one, which is Stern Justice.
And links are in the description, as always, below, or you can find it wherever you buy your books. So we talked with Guy Walters yesterday, Adam, about in the ETO, there's a list begins to be compiled as early as 1943, and eventually had 60,000 names of people that were on the list to be investigated and brought to justice. The Far East has a slightly different process, and again, there's this weirdly, as the circle constricts around the Third Reich in 1945, everything does concentrate on Berlin, and the Germans are, those that are still alive, are pushed back there. Even with the dropping of atomic bombs, at that point, the Japanese are still spread out over various places. There's still these sort of enclaves, and despite the iron hopping campaign. So how did the process, how and when did the process begin in the Far East amongst the Allies about this idea of bringing justice about and trying particular people?
It was much later in the process than it was in Europe. So as you said, the Allies had decided by 1943 they were going to hold war crimes trials in Europe. At that time, they were still ambivalent on holding them in the Far East. It was only towards 1945 and when they were drafting the Potsdam Declaration, which was their call on Japan to surrender, which they made in July 1945, that they made a formal public commitment to holding war crimes trials. So that was in the Potsdam Declaration, where they said that we do not intend that the Japanese shall be destroyed as a nation, but we will bring stern justice to the war criminals who have wrought cruelties on our prisoners. However, individual allies had been considering the idea of war crimes trials in the Pacific much before that. including Australia. And Australia took an interest in this from a very early stage. And over 1943, 1944, 1945, the Australian government commissioned 4 reports on Japanese war crimes, conventional war crimes in the Pacific, and assembled them into reports with the intention that they might one day be used to bring Japanese officers to trial.
Thank you. And one of the things we discussed with Guy was that there are the treatment of specific crimes. So there is a particular camp commandant or a Japanese officer or German officer who has been shooting people with a pistol in the field against the rules of war, and then morphing into this more general war against crimes against humanity, which becomes a lot vaguer and harder to prosecute and raise questions. We're talking about Klaus Barbie later today, who of course was France's first crimes against humanity trial. So with the Japanese trials, there isn't, because of the, you mentioned there isn't the Holocaust per se. There's ill treatment of people and murders of people, but it's not quite as easily labeled as the Holocaust. So how does that distinction work in the Far East between sort of conventional military crimes where this person did this thing and this wider sense of inhumane treatment?
It's a very good question, Paul, because the Allies wanted as much as possible to be consistent between the two theatres. So generally, everything they did with the war crimes trials in the Pacific followed what they did in Europe. So the charter for the Tokyo trial closely follows the charter for the Nuremberg trial, and the lesser war crimes trials in the Pacific followed principles that were established in Europe as well. So to understand how the war crimes trials work, it's necessary to understand the distinction between 3 classes of war crimes, and this applied across Europe and across the Pacific. So there were Class A war crimes, which were crimes against peace. So this was starting an aggressive war in violation of a treaty. And this is what the leaders of Germany were tried for at Nuremberg, as well as the leaders of Japan at Tokyo. Then there are the Class B war crimes, which is, as you say, shooting prisoners of war, shooting civilians, forcing civilians to be slave laborers, plundering, this sort of thing. And the leaders of Germany and Japan were put on trial for these Class B war crimes as well, but so were many officers in lesser courts in both Europe and the Far East. So then there's the third category, which is Class C war crimes, or crimes against humanity. And this had no precedent before the Second World War, and it was created specifically for the Holocaust. The reason being is that many of the victims of the Holocaust were German civilians, and there was no precedent for putting somebody on trial for committing a crime against their own citizens. So there had been a couple of war crimes trials after the American Civil War. There had been some brave but unsuccessful war crimes trials after the First World War for these conventional war crimes, but this was the first time someone had tried to put somebody on trial for a crime against humanity, so a government killing its own civilians. So this was an important distinction in Europe. In the Pacific, it was not as an important distinction because, in general, the people who were victims of the Japanese military were victims in areas they occupied. Wartime Japan did have a very authoritarian government that suppressed dissent, but it didn't kill large numbers of people in Japan itself. So in the Pacific, the Class B and Class C distinction doesn't matter too much, and we talk about Class B/C trials because they tended to get bundled together.
Okay, thank you. And this, even breaking down to the classifications, is been making me now think of what the mood of the civilians is. And your book talks about the fact it's not just what the military want, it's what the people want. The people across the world have wanted this terrible war to come to an end. It has come to an end, and in the Far East kind of quite abruptly because of the dropping of atomic bombs. It could have gone on a bit longer, and bang, it comes to a pretty dramatic end there. In Australia, particularly, what is the mood of the general public? Was it easy for you as a historian to look and gauge that there is a specific mood in 45, or depends what people want? I mean, to some extent, you're still waiting for your people to come, your troops to come back, because I remember some of the troop ships, taking weeks to get back to Australia. So, what are people's concerns on the main, in Australia at the time?
Sure. There was definitely a very strong desire towards the end of the war and immediately after the war to see people who committed atrocities, particularly against Allied prisoners of war brought to trial. For example, one of the atrocities which really captured the public imagination was the massacre of the Australian nurses at Manus Island by Japanese army. And obviously something like that, more so even than the, say, using prisoners of war as forced labour on the Burma Railway, really had a desire to see these people dealt with. And in both theatres and across all countries, there were people who said, let's just shoot them without trial. And you see that in America and Britain, Canada, Australia. But in the Australian government and in many parts of the Australian community, there was a strong desire to see actual trials, to see this handled in a way that was consistent with what they referred to as the principles of British justice.
Thank you. And I'm going to let you let you talk. I've asked a few questions down to let you talk about your process and what you try to do. And, again, we're trying to focus on the Australian angle, but I think one of the things that is going to definitely be highlighted by this series is that it is a very complicated procedure, dealing with the end of the war, dealing with movements of peoples back to where they're from. The Americans are now moving in, gradually beginning to think of moving into Japan. The potential of communist and Cold War is coming in, and yet there's this looking backwards at exacting justice for some of these crimes. And as you said, Australia have been victims of some specific crimes, sometimes on a quite small scale, the Rimau raid, Jaywick, things like that, these individual cases that made your press. So you've now got to deal with all of this. And Australia, you've spent a lot of money in World War II. You're never going to be the major player like the US, the UK are. So I feel quite sorry for Australia's position to go through this as a relatively small voice, but yet with a very big investment in this procedure.
So Australia was a big push for trials in the Pacific, and more so in many ways than the other allies. And that's probably in a large part because of the foreign minister, H.V. Evatt, who was also the Attorney General, and he was really keen on the idea of there being trials. And as I've said before, the Australian government began collecting evidence quite early. Up until the end of the war, it wasn't clear exactly how the trials would work. And, the Allies created this body, the United Nations War Crimes Commission, and there was some idea that they might coordinate all the trials. However, after the war finished, everyone basically decided this was going to be impractical, and they started holding trials wherever they were. So, for example, the British Army began holding trials of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp guards. So Australia as well, wherever the Australian Army had stopped in August 1945, began holding trials at Wewak in Papua New Guinea, at Rabaul, which was occupied shortly after the end of the war, at Morotai in the Dutch East Indies, and at Labuan in British North Borneo. And that picture up on the screen there shows 4 Japanese guards under guard by Australian military police at Labuan. So Labuan was then in British North Borneo. Today it's part of Malaysia. Generally, the prisoners which were taken in Borneo were the Japanese guards of prisoners of war camps in Borneo. Many of the British and Australian and other Allied soldiers who were captured in the fall of Singapore were sent to prisoners of war camps in Borneo. And conditions for prisoners in the Japanese Empire varied. They were never good, but they were better or worse in some cases than others. And in Borneo, they were very bad. And famously, only a handful of men out of thousands survived the Sandakan prisoners of war camp. So these are 4 Japanese prisoner of war camp guards, and these 4 men were all convicted in an Australian military court and shot. And while this was going on, there was then the push to establish the Tokyo Court, so the major war crimes trial in the Far East. And Australia pushed so hard, and the Australian government made so much noise that General MacArthur actually appointed an Australian judge, William Webb, to be the president of the court, which was a mixed decision in retrospect, because in some ways he was a very good jurist, but that job was very difficult. It really, to manage that big court, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go, that big multinational court really took someone with a lot of personal and political skill, and Webb probably wasn't quite there. And the court had a lot of problems. Not all of them were his fault, but some of them certainly were.
No, absolutely. I think we'll get into later as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. You know, we've got the photo there of the guards being on trial, because it's that. I think the recurring theme in this series is going to be where does the point of blame start? You know,
Yes.
at what point in the chain of command is the fault? Where does it commence? Because
Yeah.
you know, we've had shows on the channel in the past about the Japanese POW camps, and how in many ways the guards are on as poor rations as the people the prisoners they're looking after. And despite the fact there is obviously incredible amounts of brutality, the Japanese guards themselves are victims to some extent of the system. And you get in the ETO, you get on like the death marches, the German guards walking alongside the prisoners because some sort of bond has been established, because they're all at some point on some scale victims of the evil hierarchy above them. So does Australia go into this with an intention of kind of trying to find out, okay, these people are responsible of horrific crimes, but did they start the mechanism? How does Australia deal with that?
So that at the time was a very controversial question to ask. The reason being is that if you say, well, let's work our way up the chain of command, eventually where do you end up? With the emperor.
Yeah.
And so there was this question of, do you put the emperor on trial? The Australian government was strongly of the view that the Allies should put the emperor on trial, and the list of war crime suspects had Hirohito in big letters at the top. But the other Allies didn't share that view. The Soviet Union eventually came around to it. New Zealand was on the fence, but didn't quite come over. But the UK and the US in particular were opposed, and for quite good reason, because the emperor had said he was willing to cooperate with the Allies. His cooperation would make the occupation and demilitarization and de-radicalization of Japan so much easier. So there was that difficult question of, on one hand, he almost certainly had a lot of responsibility for what had happened, but on the other hand, there was a lot of value in not putting him on trial. My conclusion at the end of Stern Justice was that not putting him on trial was a legal travesty, but a practical necessity. And that obviously then raises questions throughout the process. Particularly, Japan in the 1940s was still quite a Confucian society. So it still had many of those values where if you are below somebody in the hierarchy, you're expected to obey them, but they're expected to take responsibility for you. So for Japanese officers or soldiers, the idea of refusing to obey an order, and that was often just not considered. The idea they might be put on trial in a court for following an order was absurd to them, because the courts and the legal system exist to punish people who break the social order, not those who follow it. So there was this thread of complexity through the war crimes trials in the Far East. Then at the other end of the scale, you had people at the bottom of the hierarchy, particularly Taiwanese and Korean guards. Generally, the Allies, Australia as well, didn't put private soldiers on trial, or at least not when they were directly following orders. Most of the defendants that I come across are at least non-commissioned officers. They might be a sergeant or a sergeant major, or more commonly a lieutenant, a captain, or a more senior officer. So generally, the Allies weren't going after ordinary privates, but they were definitely going after people who were quite junior in the hierarchy. And there are some quite sad accounts you read, for some of the trials where you see a man who beheaded a prisoner of war because his commanding officer told him, and he said, I cut the man as quickly as I could so he wouldn't suffer. And I thought that was all I could do for him in the circumstances.
And with that in mind, Adam, do you think that everybody involved was aware that they need to have some kind of swift response to this, to provide some kind of results quickly? Because if, for example, they said, look, we're going to, this process of trying the criminals is going to take us 10 years, right? We're going to transition through getting these countries rebuilt and running as organizations, and then we're going to gradually build our cases, and we're going to start the trials in, I don't know, 1955, let's say. the public wouldn't have put up with that. There was obviously a need to have some immediate proactive response to the awful crimes committed, and bring some examples so they can say on the front of the newspapers in Melbourne and Sydney, here is this guy, he murdered Australian soldiers, he has now met his end as a result of the process. So that need to bring instant results, do you think that ultimately harmed the process?
It goes both ways, because on one hand, you see the earlier trials were sometimes quite rough and ready. Like, if you look at the Labuan trials, which is the one on the screen, sometimes the translation wasn't very good. So obviously they hadn't been able to get hold of a good translator. And you see some sometimes almost tragicomic errors of translation in the transcripts, where they describe being tortured to death as not very fun. And then, there were often like a lack of qualified people for defense. Some of the trials had too many defendants. On the other hand, though, it was very hard to move people around the Pacific immediately after the war, when you had there were so many Japanese soldiers still scattered from Papua New Guinea all the way up through to China. And as trials went on, they became under criticism for taking too long. In my opinion, that's certainly a valid criticism. This happened in 1947. The Tokyo trial was still going on. There was still Class B and C war crimes trials going on. 1948, there was still going on. Tokyo was wrapped up in 1948, but at that point, the war went over for 3 years. And it's a principle of justice that justice should be swift.
Yeah.
And so by the end of the 1940s, and the trials were still going on there, and people were still being held awaiting trial, there was more and more pressure to say, let's just wrap this up. If we haven't dealt with it now, we need to just move on.
Thank you. You talked about, for example, the difference in opinion amongst the Allies about what to do about the Emperor. In terms of the actual building cases, Ian Carr had a great question for you. It says, was sourcing of information on Japanese suspects coordinated between US, UK, and Australia, and indeed Chinese and other allied nations there? So in terms of just sharing of information, how did that work during this process?
So for the Tokyo trial, which was conducted by a multinational bench of judges, there was the international prosecution section at Tokyo. So that was comprised of prosecutors from the UK, Australia, the US, all the other countries which participated on the court, and even some observers from Indonesia and Burma. And so they pooled their resources for the prosecution of those Class A war criminals. For the lesser trials, the Class B and C trials, they were conducted by the individual countries. And in some cases, there was some sharing of information. Like, for example, I found one case where a Chinese officer actually sat in an Australian court because the Australian court was trying a case of brutality against Chinese prisoners of war. But they were coordinated largely by the individual power. And maybe I might roll through that. I'll talk a little bit about the Tokyo trial of the international bench, and also the Class B and C trials as well. So that's the courtroom in Tokyo. You can see on the left is the bench, on the right are the defendants. The Tokyo trial had a number of problems. The prosecution was run by an American named Joseph Keenan. His experience was prosecuting gangsters during the Great Depression, and he honestly bungled the prosecution at Tokyo. The indictment was a mess. The cross-examination of key witnesses was often done badly. The cross-examination of Tojo was a mess, and the court ended up dragging on for that and for some other reasons as well. So this is the bench at Tokyo. For those of you who know, the Nuremberg trial only had 4 judges. So there was a judge from the US, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union, and then 4 alternates. Tokyo was deliberately decided to expand the court. So in addition to those 4 powers, they were joined by Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and nationalist China. At the time, China was involved in a civil war between the communists and the nationalists, but the Allies recognized the nationalist government. And then once the court had been assembled before the trial started, the Allies decided to bring in a judge from India and from the Philippines. India was moving towards independence, and the Philippines was newly independent. And that was interesting because this was one of the first points at which those nations had begun to stand up equally on the world stage as an equal participant with a European country. So the Tokyo trial and the trials throughout the Far East in general are really interesting from this point of view of decolonization. And you're seeing these nations, which in 1939 had just been a colony of a European power, or in the case of the Philippines, an overseas protectorate of the US, transitioning to being fully independent. And part of their journey to independence was what role they would play in the war crimes trials process and the eventual reconciliation with Japan.
Interesting stuff. Do you want to go for the rest of your slides? And we've got lots of questions coming in, and then I'm enjoying the conversation. By the way, it's as much as you can enjoy a conversation about war crimes.
Yeah, and it's not a very cheerful topic, unfortunately, but you'll have to find a more cheerful topic to write my next book on. Then the last one I'll run through before I take some more questions. So in addition to those actually holding the Tokyo trial, all of these countries held some of their own trials in the Far East. And I've just put up some numbers there if anyone wants to. I'll pause the video, you can see. Obviously, Australia was a fairly major player, 294 trials. Obviously, the US was the biggest. And you see the Philippines did quite a few, and I understand you're going to have a historian to talk about that, and that'll be quite interesting, a very interesting story about the Philippines' journey towards independence. So yeah, happy to take some. And so this is just a map of where the Australian trials were held. So initially at Wewak in Papua New Guinea, Rabaul, some in Darwin. That didn't go very well because they were flooded by the Australian media, who complained the sentences were too lenient. So the Australian government decided to hold the rest of its trials out of the country. And Morotai. Then after those venues became unavailable or unsuitable, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then the final round of trials in 1951 and 1950 on Manus Island. I'm happy to take some more questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad thank you, Adam. I'm glad you mentioned China and India becoming part of the process in terms of being on the the panel there, because as you said there, they are going through their own massive transitions in how they are as nations. Because we had a fantastic question coming in from Ernest Malley, who's a pretty regular viewer, but not normally, because we're normally at the wrong time of day, because he's in your part of the world. Ernest would say, would it be fair to say Australian prosecutors ignored or at least failed to pursue crimes perpetrated against local Papuans? And that's something that has been more of a thing in recent years, where we've looked at, for example, the Nazi treatment of non-white people as well as the Japanese, because as I said there, the kind of the idea we have is that the Brits want revenge for the Brits killed in their engagements, and the Australians want justice for the Australian commandos and Z-men and things like that. So in terms of the Japanese, they are doing a whole lot of crap against non-white people across the extent of their empire. Papua, the Philippines, Burma, Myanmar. Then is it fair to say that everybody's a little bit less worried, or less concerned is probably a better word, about what happened to non-white people in this era?
So you can make a number of very fair criticisms of the way Australia conducted the war crimes trials, but something which I found actually was very much in the favour of the Australian approach, and something which reflects quite favourably in Australia, was there did seem to be a real will and desire to prosecute crimes against Melanesian and Polynesian people. This happened in Papua New Guinea and in the Pacific Islands. And one of the trials I look at in detail was one that was held in Rabaul that dealt with the massacre of the population of Ocean Island, or Bonuba Island, in the Gilbert Islands by the Japanese Navy, which is actually after the war finished. The Japanese Navy shot all the islanders on about August the 20th, 1945, after the end of the war. And there was one islander, it was a man named Cabanare, survived, and he hid in a cave. And he eventually, when the British occupied the island, he eventually met some other Gilbert Islanders, and he was flown to Rabaul as a witness. And the Australian government then went to the trouble to find a Gilbertese translator to translate for him. So in some ways, absolutely, you can see cases where they were focused on Australian prisoners of war and brushed over other atrocities. But you do definitely see trials where Australian prosecutors went to a lot of effort to prosecute some of these Japanese officers for crimes against Polynesian and Melanesian people.
Thank you. We had another question going back to what I was asking you about Australian public opinion, and Fraser, and he's not saying this in sort of a trying to trip you up way, just genuinely interested, is what actually do we know about what the Australian public thought immediately after World War II about these war crimes? What sources are there? Because, you know, I know when I'm looking at, for example, living in France as I do, French newspapers in 1945 aren't necessarily speaking for the whole of France. They're speaking for the media moguls who are running newspapers, as indeed we know today. So, you know, you were tackling this subject when your book, I think, was 2018, was it? So it's, I guess you were writing it nearly a decade ago. So you're looking back at that point, 70 years. What's your answer? How do you know what the people of Australia were thinking back then?
So the newspapers in particular, letters to the editor and op-eds in smaller newspapers, the biggest source. There are some other sources as well. For example, letters that people sent to MPs. Is another great one. I can see, you know, the Progressive Women's Association of Broken Hill wrote a letter to the Foreign Minister asking that, you know, the Japanese war criminals be hanged. Then there's a few diary entries and views of the Australians involved in the trials themselves.
It's interesting the Women's Institute there, because that in Canada with the trials of people like Kurt Mann, I've got Tim Cook on next week. It was the Women's Institute who are actually saying it's not an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They are the ones sort of requesting a kinder approach to criminals. So it's interesting that even with the Women's Institute, which is a global thing, that there might not be a national, an agreed upon view globally.
Well, this was the Progressive Women's Association of Broken Hill, which is a small town in Western New South Wales. So I'm not sure how.
I don't want to get involved. They sound scary.
Yes.
They are. We've had some questions about the legal process, and I said again on Friday we've got an expert on, Michael Bryant, talking about how in the ETO, particularly the Allies, as you said, there was no precedent for crimes against humanity, how they begin to phase in a new legal framework. So, you know, it's in the news right now in the USA and what have you about this, you know, everyone innocent until proven guilty, right for trial, due process, things like that. From the Australian point of view and your research point of view, what were the hurdles that had to be overcome during this process? In that, you know, you want to give people the right to defend themselves, but you said there's interpreter difficulties, language difficulties. People have got a right to appeal. People are asking about that. What specific problems came up and had to be dealt with in this process, as you found out?
So the Australian trials the B&C trials were conducted under the War Crimes Act, which was passed in a hurry at the end of the war to establish the courts. And the principle that the Australian government took was that they'd be military courts martial. So the same type of military court martial that would try a soldier for a military offence was trying these war crimes suspects. So it was a panel of officers, and then a judge advocate who was someone with legal qualifications who could advise the court on the law, and then somebody to speak for prosecution, somebody to speak for defence. That question about evidence and fairness is an interesting one, because the War Crimes Act suspended the rule against hearsay evidence. So in general, in a court of law in a common law country like your country and mine, you can't be convicted on hearsay evidence. I heard he confessed to the crime. There are certain exceptions to that, but it has to be from the person themselves. And you also, if there's a document that's used as evidence, then the person who produced that document should have to come and be cross-examined on it. Those rules were relaxed, so those rules of evidence were relaxed for the Australian war crimes trials. The Parliament's view was justice demanded that they wouldn't be able to prosecute people for these heinous crimes without this, but it was controversial even at the time. And even you will see people involved in the war crimes trials themselves saying they weren't totally comfortable with, you know, people being convicted based on evidence that wouldn't stand up in a civilian court.
Well, there have been a couple of books. Yeah, there've been a couple of books written fairly recently about kind of the travesty of the Tokyo trials and how it was sort of a pile on, and it wasn't necessarily by today's standards thoroughly legal. And this, we're gradually moving into this again, back to this subject of public opinion, because for example, the death penalty. The further a country seems to get away after having removed the death penalty, do a certain number of the population start insisting on having it again, and capital punishment, all that kind of thing. And so there's the trial process. Then there's also the how you're going, what sort of justice you're going to mete out to someone once you've found them guilty. So from the Australian point of view, was there a particular opinion that justice should be severe? Because again, we're talking about Canada next week, Australia.
Easily, like the view in Japan and Australia at the end of the Second World War was shoot them. And those also obviously racialized attitudes at the time as well.
Of course.
That it was acceptable to see the media referring to the Japanese as apes, as wild animals, as barbarians. Admittedly, the Japanese media referred to Westerners in similar terms, but there's definitely, and even in some cases, you see people saying, there's no point holding trials for these people. They're just completely uncivilized. We should just shoot them in the same way you would shoot a rabid dog. I have a lot of respect for the defense counsel of those trials, because they took on a very difficult job in the face of that public opinion to defend these men and try to give them the best possible defense they could. It was not controversial in Australia that all of the courts would be able to apply the death penalty, nor, as far as I know, is it controversial in the other countries as well. The War Crimes Act allowed for death by hanging, death by shooting, a term of imprisonment, and oddly enough, a fine. Nobody, as far as I can tell, was actually fined for committing war crimes. So I don't know why that was put in. But those were all options, and court-martial isn't required to give its reasons in the same way a civilian court is. So we don't actually know in cases where the courts opted for the death penalty versus imprisonment or vice versa why they made that decision.
Thank you. In your research about the perpetrators, so the generals, the camp commandants, the officers, and what have you, when we have the Third Reich and we have the ETO, it often falls down on the was the person a Nazi or not, and there's that plethora of memoirs by German generals after war, some of whom are possibly in line to be investigated and tried, who are trying to distance themselves from the ideology, the mechanism, and it's sort of an extension of the I was only following orders type thing. Well, with the Japanese, it becomes a little bit complicated, because we don't have the distinction between a kind of a loyal Nazi Japanese and a regular Japanese. So in your research, again, with some of the people who know they're going to be tried, or they're in the process there, were some of these figures allowed? Did they court the press? Did they speak to their own press? Did they write memoirs? What sort of things were they saying, the Japanese, at the time of the trials, about their own culpability, or did they give any clues about the mechanism?
Yeah, so we do have letters and memoirs from the defendants themselves, and some were assembled in Japan, and I quote some of them in the book. Some of them were interviewed by Western journalists, particularly for the Australian trials, Australian journalists. Their views tend to be more nuanced as time goes on. So for the defendants in the 1950-1951 trials, you get some quite lengthy and retrospective accounts of their experience in the war. In general, though, their view was, I was a loyal soldier. I obeyed the emperor. I don't know why I'm on trial. Why isn't my commanding officer on trial? Why isn't the general of the army in Tokyo on trial? Why isn't the prime minister on trial? Which he was, but there was very much that idea of that. Those people were responsible for me. I followed them. They should take responsibility for me now. And that caused a massive backlash against authority in Japan after the war, when people really felt let down if they if they had just followed the orders, done what they were told, and then they were being put on a trial, it's like the people in charge had broken the social contract and betrayed them.
So almost like, from their point of view, either they're all guilty or they're all innocent. Because it's either the Japanese system is guilty or it isn't. Whereas again, in the ETO with the Nazis, you get that, no, the system was guilty, but I wasn't in the system. I didn't choose to be part of this. I was always separate from the system. I was just doing my job as an independent general stroke contractor for the Third Reich. And I think that comparison is going to be coming up a lot in this series of this, the mindset. Again, it brings us back this where guilt sits. Is everybody involved in it? Is the guy who drives the train to Auschwitz as guilty as the guy who sits in the guard tower? It's a complicated question. I think we don't have any answers. Another really tough question from Ernest Malley here. On Ambon, there were instances of Australian officers using the Japanese to punish their own men involving extreme violence. Did this embarrassing fact put a brake on what crimes could be investigated? So, I'll let you handle that.
Oh, sure. I looked very briefly at the Ambon trials. I didn't look into them as in much detail as some of the others I looked at. There were cases of violence against Japanese prisoners immediately after the war. There were cases at Rabaul, for example, where the Australians found it convenient just to allow the Japanese officers to discipline their own men, in some cases very harshly. That didn't seem to put a brake on any of the trials, the investigations. And occasionally, and actually, I'll go back a step. The Japanese prisoners themselves could give very different accounts of their times in captivity. Some said, I've been treated just as brutally as I treated any prisoner. I don't know why I'm on trial. I don't know why these people aren't on trial for mistreating me. Others, though, even some of those who were sentenced to death, said, I got a fair trial. The Australians were gentlemen. I've got no complaints.
Great, simple question from Gary there. Did any plead guilty? Did anyone say, yep, I did it, Gov?
Oh, good question. None that I found. Every trial that I looked at was contested.
And that in itself is kind of just hold that thought and consider that for 10 seconds, because that, folks, does give a little bit of insight into what's going on there. We've had to postpone a show from this week with Dr. Philip Blood, where he's going to be looking at the Third Reich. Some of the defendants, or not necessarily defendants, but witnesses. Are they turncoats? Are they trustworthy? Are they just trying to preserve their own lives? And the fact that they all, from what you're seeing, from your research, they all don't think they're guilty is really interesting.
I mean, somebody might have pled guilty, but none of the trials that I looked at. So of the nearly 300, I probably dove into about a dozen, and none of those the defendants pleaded guilty.
Okay, so the next thing I want to bring up is the legacy and historiography of this, because I don't live in Australia, I live in France, because going back this idea about public mood with regards to things like capital punishment. I mean, I think back of the 80s and those incredible Australian mini-series that came out, Heroes, about Jaywick and Rimau, and there was lots of kind of TV movies, Attack Force Z, the terrible one with Mel Gibson, where they were looking at what Australia was doing in the war in the Pacific and the resulting crimes committed by Japanese. Was there a mood shift then in the 70s and 80s different to today? How has the perception of the war crimes trials about whether the Australians were too harsh, not harsh enough, how has it changed in 8 decades?
So what I found was almost as soon as the trials finished, the last trials were held on Manus Island in 1951, they were buried. In some cases, almost deliberately, the National Archives for decades wouldn't release the transcripts. I'm not sure why, although they're now digitized through it online. And there doesn't seem to have been really any public interest or debate in the Australian trial since then. Like, as I said, even as someone who's fairly well informed, until I was 30, I had not heard of these Australian Class B and C war crimes trials. So one of the reasons I wrote the book, in fact, was to raise this question again and say, looking back 8 to 7 decades, 8 decades, what do we think now? There was a bit of academic interest. A few people wrote a PhD thesis on the trials, and there was an academic book that was published slightly before mine was, but still not that much attention in the popular press. And it's not the sort of story I think that really catches the Australian imagination. We want our heroes to be, soldiers, protecting their mates and fighting for their country rather than, a lawyer who's meticulously making sure a Japanese war criminal gets a fair trial. Although I think that, maybe I'm biased because I'm a lawyer myself, but I think the lawyer who's making sure the war criminal is getting a fair trial, is worthy of commendation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think this is one of the reasons I'm doing this series is that it is a complicated subject, both because of the legal precedents that existed and the process itself, but also of the fact that, as I said to Guy Walters, and people just want to enjoy the war being over. They want to enjoy this. Can we just have a Mars bar and sit in the sun and enjoy having our family together again without thinking about dredging up again all this stuff that we all know this shit happened. We all know this stuff happened. We all know that Uncle Bert isn't coming back because he died in Shanghai. But do we really need to go through the process of doing all this when there's other things we can? And I can completely understand that mindset back there and the difficulties everybody was dealing with in whether or not or how to invest in this process. You want to see justice served, but you also want to kind of move forward. It's complicated.
Yeah. Indeed, that's exactly right.
So we've got a few minutes left. Any particular stories or trials or individuals from your book that you think are worthy of note, either because they stand against the other cases or they're a good example of the trials? Any particular cases?
So the one that I found the most interesting and compelling was the one that I mentioned before, the trial on Ocean Island for the massacre of the Pacific Islanders, and this account of this one sole survivor. But there was another. I had an interesting personal experience actually, and I'll you have to just bring the slides up again, and I'll show a picture. Oh, this, by the way, is the court in Darwin. Let's see on the left is the court itself, and on the right, defendants bowing to the court. But this trial here, which took place on Rabaul in the first round of the trials. So on the left, there's 3 Japanese officers, and the man in the middle who's looking at the camera is Captain Hoshijima. He was the commandant of the Sandakan prisoner of war camp, and he was an infamously brutal commander. You hear accounts of prisoners of war being put for days in cages in the sun and dying of exposure. He would put food out near starving men and having soldiers shoot anyone who tried to eat the food. This sort of thing. He kept stockpiles of quinine while his men were dying of malaria. During his trial, when he was asked why most of the prisoners had died, well, none of the guards had. He said he just thought Westerners weren't as suited to the tropical climate as the Japanese were, and they would just die of tropical diseases, even though he'd been starving the men and not feeding them and beating them. And he was put on trial on the evidence of the Australian soldier in the middle on the right, whose name was Bill Stipuich, who was one of only about half a dozen of the thousands of prisoners of war who survived Sandakan and the Sandakan Renau Death March. And he was convicted of rebellion. Hoshijima was convicted and hanged based on that. He was, unsurprisingly, he was one of those defendants who really captured the attention of the media. He was very much public enemy number one. After I published the book, I received a letter from a man who said that his father had been a translator at the Rabaul trials and wanted to meet me. And I drove out to a retirement village out of our suburbs of Melbourne, and I spent an hour or so with this man who was in his 90s, who had been at university when the war broke out. The Australian government offered to put people through Japanese courses as quickly as possible because very few Australians could speak Japanese, and they knew they would need Japanese speakers as translators. So he finished his Japanese course, went into the army. The war had finished at this point, but he was made a translator at Rabaul. And he was actually the translator at Hoshijima's trial. And he told me that he sat down, across the table from Hoshijima and spoke to him, in Japanese to help prepare his defense. And so I was naturally curious. I said, well, what was he like? What was this monstrous commander, a genuine Axis war criminal? What was it like to sit at the table and speak to him? And he said it was just like any other person. And I think which is a fairly common thing you hear about some of these people. That was, the banality of evil. Comment as well. This the Hoshijima for, and he looks quite cocky in that photo, but he was an engineer by trade, and he could have just been anyone you might meet when you go down to the bank or get your driver's license renewed. And that was something that stuck with me, and it's a reminder that the people who committed these atrocities were not that different from anybody else.
Yeah,
and I think it's an important point to keep in mind that maybe a lot of us have that in us, in that sort of circumstance. Like, what would we do?
Yeah, I mean, it's even the language. We use the word atrocity. Some of these people, it was just another day at the office. It was that, for me, that was a Tuesday. Me mistreating by our standards a captive was for them just another day at the office, and that applies whether you're one of the worst Japanese or one of the worst Nazis. The how very quickly these people became institutionalized to the evil that they're part of, and it just becomes part of their job. We've done a show in the past about the use of alcohol in the German in the Third Reich, and how normal it was to just go out and go on partisan hunting expeditions into the forest and come back and keep a running tally of how many people you've killed, and how normal it becomes. If it becomes something you do all the time, it becomes normal. I think that this ultimately is the dilemma of the war crimes. Is the Allies are coming at this from this quite rightly aghast at the awfulness of what they're facing, but the perpetrators don't see it in the same way, and there's a sort of a gulf of just understanding.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Well, that runs through the trials, and in writing this book, I had to read about some particularly heinous atrocities, things like the Nanking massacre. But I also found some of the defendants were almost sympathetic in some ways, like these people who were raised and brutalized in this system. Yeah,
I mean, there's a member of FEPAL, the Scottish version association of FEPAL in the sidebar today, and I was an associate member of the Far Eastern Prisoners of War in Essex in England when I was a teenager. Went to a few meetings, and it was little circles of. They weren't that old then, because we're talking 30 years ago, but they were old. They'd survived the war, sort of sitting in circles. It was almost like a sort of self-help group. And bear in mind, folks, I was also going to things like other evenings. I'd go to the associate members of the Chelmsford Parachute Regiment Association, where it's all guys chatting around, talking about Arnhem and hoisting beers and the para ethos. But the FEPAL meetings were just awful, just sitting in circles describing the things that they saw personally, things they saw happening to Chinese women, Indian, whatever it would be. But I never at any of these meetings ever got to sit and face one of the perpetrators. All I heard was the victim stories, which I of course completely believed. But I don't know how, if then the 20-year-old me had been faced with a group of some of the Japanese guards or something, how I would have gone into that. I have no idea. I probably would have found them, as you said, distinctly normal and boring. There we are. David Watts is suggesting the book The Knights of Bushido in the sidebar there, about that kind of Japanese mentality, and I think we will definitely explore this later on, and we're going to be looking at the crimes in the Philippines. We're going to look at the Tokyo trials in greater detail from the American point of view, but right now I need to go to cheer myself up. But it's been fantastic talking to you, Adam. This has been an incredible subject, and I'm glad you've brought us some insight into Australia's point of view going into these trials, how the process worked, and it's a great beginning to this series from the Japanese point of view. So thank you, Adam. It's been great talking to you. Thanks everybody for your questions. I'm back in 2 hours' time talking to Richard about the Barbie trial. So as always, click like and subscribe. Buy my guest books. The link is in the description below to Adam's book. And you've written about, tell us about your other book about the Great War and the Australians coming back home. Just plug that before we go.
That's Charles. Yeah, so I wrote a book called The Last 50 Miles. Australia and the end of the Great War, which was about the machinations around the end of the First World War, and the impact the war had on Australia, and the impact on Australian politics, Australian society, as well as the accounts of the battles themselves that Australians took part in the Western Front.
Brilliant stuff. Well, there you are. Thanks, folks. I will see you in a few hours' time. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV. Enjoy the few hours you have before you see me all again. Cheers, everybody. Bye.